So hello everyone and welcome to our webinar on the Land Use Framework, Next Steps for Implementation and Delivery. My name is Georgie Barber. I'm the Land Use Lead at the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, and we are very pleased to see the Land Use Framework published last week. Originally committed to in 2022, it's seen, I think, 6 Secretaries of State. So it's been a long time coming and a breath of relief for everyone involved. I'm going to do some quick introductions of our panel. First, we have Max Heaver, who is part of the team from DEFRA, the Land Use Framework team, who pulled together the framework, who will shortly be part of the new Land Use Unit. Max has previously worked on the development of BMG metrics in DEFRA, and I believe is continuing to lead on the Making Land Digital portion of the Land Use Unit, but he can talk to that a bit more later. Secondly, we have Phil Stocker. Phil is Chief Executive of the National Sheep Association and has a background of development work in organic farming, following a career in farming and farm management. He is also the independent chair of the Dartmoor Land Use Management Group, which was established to implement the key recommendations from the first review, one of which was to establish a multifunctional land use framework for Dartmoor. Thirdly, we have Carolyn Mackenzie, who is Director for Environment and Planning at Surrey County Council. So she's responsible for leading and driving the development and high-level agreement and operational delivery of strategy for place, including the environment, transport, climate and sustainability. She also chairs the Environment Board for ADAPT, as well as being on the National Steering Group for Natural England's National Nature Reserves, and has been appointed chair of the Greater South East Net Zero Hub. And finally, closing the panel, we have Sue Pritchard, the Chief Executive of the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. Sue has been at the vanguard of the Land Use Framework journey for a long time, having developed a proposal for it in 2019 and has led 2 action research pilots on what this might look like in Devon and Cambridgeshire. She is also the Governor at the Royal Agricultural University, a member of the Net Zero Council, and also Farms in Wales. So welcome to this webinar. As I say, the framework was published last week to great fanfare. It's a huge step forward. The first time this kind of policy has been announced in England, first time so many different constituent parts of land and land use have been brought together in one place. The framework sets out, firstly, the need for the framework, recognising the various different demands of land, including housing, clean energy, food production, nature recovery, landscapes for water, resilient landscapes and communities, and a vision for what England could look like in 2030 and 2050 across these areas. It also sets out new spatial analysis of how much land area will be needed to be dedicated to this changing land management practices, climate and nature benefits, energy generation and urban expansion. It includes a set of principles to guide land use decision makers and a mapping of policies and actions that will bring together these visions into being. Overall, the framework has had, I would say, a very positive response. It's been welcomed as a necessary step to meet all of these various challenges, and people across the media, trade media, across different sectors have recognised that this is a great start and a signpost to what needs to happen. However, a policy is only ever good as its delivery. And so now I get to the nitty-gritty of implementation and how it will work in practice. And for this, I present our webinar. So Max, I will hand over to you to start.
Great, thank you very much, Georgie, and to Sue, who I think is about to be sharing some slides to talk us through this. So as you said, I'm Max from DEFRA, and I worked on the Land Use Framework and have done for a few years. Here, I'm going to introduce the framework itself, give you a little bit of context and background on how we got here, that's doing something very funny to my screen. There we go. A little bit of how we got there and why government ultimately published Land Use Framework. So essentially, if we skip on a couple of slides to the context, which FFCC know all too well, we have a lot of different demands on land, and that's been the case for quite a few years. This perception of increasing demands for hectares with the same 13 million hectare finite amount of land in England to meet those with. So across food production, wanting to maintain food security, nature restoration, commitments to create 500,000 hectares of new habitat and restore species abundance, climate mitigation, knowing that agriculture and land use are currently about 12% of UK emissions, but are projected to grow enormously in the future, and needing to do something about that. adaptation, farmers seeing greater levels of change in weather and climate patterns that are affecting how they grow the food we need. Housing, enormous housing targets, 1.5 million homes over the Parliament, and about 150 major decisions expected on national infrastructure as well in the coming years, and of course forestry as well. Providing low carbon building materials into the future. So those are just six-ish of the main land use demands, but of course we know there's lots of other ways that land is used and enjoyed across the country as well, which we need to make room for and maintain. So we have all of these different demands on land that are perceived to be growing, finite amount of land to deal with them, and people see all of these different single issue strategies coming out of government, so environmental improvement plans, net zero delivery plans, farming roadmaps coming down the road. How do these all connect together is the question that people are starting to ask more and more. And so the likes of Henry Dimbleby through the Independent National Food Strategy and FFCC for a very long time have been calling for a land use framework to help knit this all together, understand how our land use is likely to change, and start to plan for it more proactively. So this government and the previous government committed to publishing a land use framework in their manifestos. This government wanted to do it as a consultation, recognising it's a very big issue, and we wanted to get the feedback of land managers and decision makers in how we go about it. So if we skip on to the next slide, please. We published a consultation last year, which covered three broad areas. So firstly, a vision for land use and the analysis of how that vision might play out. So taking all of our targets and commitments as government, looking at how that plays out in terms of the hectares that are likely to change. And we described those in some very broad categories of land use change, broadly ranging from things that happen in the margins of existing land uses, so things like arable field margins, through to bigger scales of land use change. So things like creating woodland where there wasn't previously woodland. So we set that out in our consultation last year and in more detail in an analytical annex. We also consulted on some principles. So if we have all these competing demands and we think we need to be smarter about the decisions we're making about land use, how can we guide government decisions to take those into account? So we set out 5 principles, which you can see there. I'll talk through the principles in more detail in the sort of final framework context later. And then in that last third box, we set out a range of actions or questions, 24 questions across the consultation on the actions that we need to take if we want to make this land use change a reality and do it with the amount of land we currently have in England, and we're not expecting to get any more. What are the changes we need to make in terms of how we incentivise change, coordinate it, give people the skills to deliver it? On to the next slide, I think, please. So thank you. And so yeah, so we ran this consultation between January and April last year. Enormous thanks to anyone who took part, either by responding to the online public consultation or coming to the many workshops that we ran. I think, yeah, we got more than 1,200 individual responses, another 6,000 campaign responses. We ran 6 workshops and some public focus groups as well in partnership with those. Additional 7 run by external organisations, some by FFCC, 3 ministerial roundtables. Essentially, we had a lot of conversations with people over a couple of months last year, which gave us an enormous and invaluable trove of feedback and insight to work through, which isn't the reason that we were slightly delayed with the framework coming through, but it was part of the reason we wanted to go through that feedback in detail, and we did. And so on the next slide, we'll talk through a little bit of what that feedback showed. Again, we published a summary of responses alongside the framework last week, which I'd really encourage you to have a look. It's quite long, but there's some really interesting stuff in there. The overarching feedback was that people were welcoming the clarity of what we were trying to do with the land use consultation, but there was lots of constructive disagreement on how exactly all of these different changes to land would likely take shape, how they could be delivered, and particularly what support or changes would help the land managers, landowners to deliver these changes that would benefit the communities around them. On the agricultural sector, there's a few specifics listed there as an example. The broader point, I think, was that in talking a lot about the land use change and the relatively small percentages of land that were moving into new uses, the consultation didn't talk enough about the land that was staying in agricultural production. So that's something we tried to correct in the land use framework itself, maintaining the importance and emphasis on sustainable food production across the country. And broadly, the point was that most agricultural people that we spoke to wanted a clearer sense of long-term policy direction from government, which again is something we aim to do in the framework. The planning sector, lots of familiar challenges with cross-sector and cross-scale link-ups. So how the water sector is talking to the housing sector, talking to the agricultural sector, and how regional and local plans join up. And then on the environmental sector, I think broadly people wanted to see more alignment between the incentives the government sets up and the policies and the targets that are set at a high level in the Environment Act. So we'd encourage you to have a look at the summary responses, but that's broadly what we heard. And so we'll go on to talk about the land use framework itself, which we published last week with ministers both at Farm and in London. And so it has three parts. So the first sets out a vision for land use out to 2050. So it sets out the purpose of the framework, within that vision, a challenge, repeating some of the sort of highlights that we heard in consultation as the challenges people found around land use and the land use change they're anticipating. Visions for land use out to 2030 and then to 2050, representing short and more tangible outcomes that we're hoping to drive on land. And then out to 2050, more aspirational long-term direction setting for government policy. And then some key insights from the land use evidence base. And we'll come on to these in more detail in the next couple of minutes. Then move on to the principles, so updated versions of those consultation principles we shared, essentially what principles we can take to coordinate government decision-making on land, and talking a little bit about how others can consider applying them too. And then implementing the framework is a raft of about 81 actions that are designed under these themes to help land managers, landowners deliver the change that we're talking about, and avoid this just being a sort of top-down imposition. How can we create the processes around it that mean that we're also taking account of local insights, local plans and priorities for the land use change? So we'll go in the next few slides into the detail beneath each of those three sections. So as I mentioned, section 1 is mostly about vision. So the visions I'd encourage you to have a look at in the land use framework, which I'm sure we'll share a link to, or maybe is linked in the event invitation for this.
Oh, have we lost Max? Is it just me, or have we lost Max?
Looks like we've lost Max.
Oh, just, you see, he used the vision word, didn't he?
There is deliver our objectives.
Max,
So look at the
Max,
vision.
just,
Hello, yeah.
I'm going to pause you for a second. We lost you for about 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Did you just go back to the start of this? Go back to the start of this slide. I thought I was going to have to do the vision slide, Max, and you know what would have happened.
Yeah, feel free to. It'll be even quicker.
No,
Yeah.
go right ahead. Go on.
Cool. Am I back and relatively?
You're back. Yeah.
So essentially, yeah. Short version is section 1 sets out the vision 2030 and 2050 for land use, and then there's an analytical component of this section as well, which basically sets out that there is enough land across the objectives, which are each of the segments of that wheel on the left, if we use our land efficiently in delivering them, and there's some scales of change set out for each of those in the document as well. Secondly, the changes should play to the strengths of the land, things that are familiar from consultation that we heard from lots of people. We should essentially do things where they make sense, put some habitats, for example, where they can contribute to water quality. And third, look at cross-sector opportunities. So that diagram on the right is showing where urban areas' water supplies are most dependent on upland peat, and the quality of that peat, their water quality. So just sort of depicting how we need to be better at looking across sectors for joined up planning, for ultimately more efficient land use outcomes. The second section moves on to the land use principles. As I said, they were updated in response to the feedback we heard, which was broadly people liked the principles but wanted them to be a bit more specific and have more examples of how they could be applied. So we've included those, and we'll aim to develop those over time as well. So those principles are ultimately multifunctionality. So land use should be planned and managed to deliver greater benefits across a range of outcomes tailored to local priorities. So examples there of solar generation is the classic one that's designed to enable continued grazing or crop production in agrivoltaic systems. Secondly, right use, right place. So land should be used in ways that align with local context and account for natural, social and economic factors. So for example, prioritising land use that are spatially sensitive. So putting food production on the really high quality farmland, and protecting the irreplaceable habitats that are already there. Future ready decisions. So looking at making sure that land use decisions take a long-term view, and this is really with an eye on climate change. So thinking out to that 2050, maybe even 2080 horizon. And for example, in tree planting, considering what species of trees you're planting, so they're going to be fit for climate conditions of the future years as well as today. And lastly, adapted by design. ensuring that land use policy and delivery can be flexible to adapt to new evidence, and ultimately how the land use change is being implemented and what we're hearing back from land managers and communities. And then the last section, the framework, section 3, is arguably the chunkiest, covering 81 actions, as I mentioned earlier, across these 4 themes. Broadly speaking, they're consistent spatial plans. So how do we get that join up across sort of horizontal levels, so getting different sectors talking to each other more about how land use change is designed and delivered at the local and regional levels, and then that vertical alignment as well. How do we get national targets supported by policies that enable local and regional planners to work those in to their own priorities as well? So example actions in this section are developing a coherent set of spatial plans for key infrastructure sectors coordinated by the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, establishing a land use unit in DEFRA to produce the first single map of spatial priorities for DEFRA outcomes across food and environment, long-term assessments of climate change impacts for 2 and 4 degree warming scenarios, and combined mapping platforms so that decision makers can see more of what sectors are planning and react to it. Secondly, supporting multifunctional and efficient land use. This is how we actually help the land managers and communities deliver that multifunctionality and delivering things in the right place. So it includes a clear long-term commitment to maintaining overall food production, because ultimately food security is a major priority for all of this land use planning, and we need to see that built into decisions. Improving agricultural land data to actually put that into practice so that planners and decision makers can see which farmland is more able to more food. Building climate change adaptation into policy design for environmental land management schemes, and some actions to ensure that tenant farmers aren't excluded or disadvantaged by land use change opportunities set out in the framework. Making land digital, which is essentially publishing lots of land use data and updating the tools that let people see that data and apply in practice. So improving combined mapping platforms, publishing a map of DEFRA's spending on land management and nature restoration so that farmers and communities can see what's happening around them. Heard from a lot of farmers that there's a bit of frustration that things are happening elsewhere in the catchment that they can't either join in with or plan for and plan around. Updating agricultural land classification maps is in there as well. And lastly, sharing the responsibility of the stewardship of land, about how we make the framework not just something we publish here with a lot of government policy commitments, but how we also bring a lot of other groups and partnerships into this to both inform the framework and the delivery of it now, but also future frameworks, because we've committed to publishing a new framework every 5 years, recognising that as we deliver this stuff and we hear more back from land managers and farmers, that will want to adapt how we're planning to do it and what support might be needed. So that runs through mayoral authorities and local government, the government estates, major landowners, so how we're going to work with the National Estates of Nature, which is a group of the largest institutional landowners, to improve how we sort of report on good practice for climate adaptation and that sort of thing. Working with landscape partnerships, which Phil may well come on to in terms of the uplands, and citizens and local communities, talking about how local communities can take on more land management in their areas, and how citizens can play their small role through management of gardens and that sort of thing. And so last slide is on the next steps of the framework, which is essentially that, as I said, there's a commitment to republish these every 5 years. So we want it to be an ongoing discussion over that period. Essentially there'll be more published later this year. We commit to publishing more analysis, including breakdowns of the analysis we set out in the document online. And so, yeah, essentially watch this space, do talk to us, do let us know what you make of the framework and the challenges you're finding in implementing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you very much, Max. I'm now going to pass over to Phil, who can give us some insights into his work in Dartmoor, and particularly the interaction of farming and nature as it relates to land use.
Thank you, Georgie. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks everyone, and thanks for that insight, Max. And I'm not going to repeat a lot of the very detailed information that Max has shared with us, really. But I mean, I think I really welcome the launch of this land use framework, and I think it does set out a national ambition with a recognition that, you know, our different land types, we've got a huge amount of various demands from our land. With increasing pressure all the time, it sets out a national ambition, I guess, for us to try to achieve what we can from our land in the appropriate places. And you know, I think that's a very good thing. I suppose in my role as the independent chair of the Dartmoor Land Use Management Group, the situation that we're in now is to try to bring some of the thinking in the national framework, in the land use framework, into being in a land area in England. That's down on Dartmoor. And Dartmoor, as you know, is an area that is recognised for its nature and its natural resources in terms of peatland and water, its role in nature, but also its role in agriculture as well. So where the land use framework talks a lot about multifunctionality, I guess we see that the different levels of multifunctionality in different land areas across England will vary depending on those land type and depending on the climate and depending on the soil type and all sorts of pressures that are on those in those areas of England. And Dartmoor is, as I say, is a national park. It's an area with a lot of land designations, SSI sites, and what the role that we're playing, or the work that we're doing, I suppose, is to follow on from the first inquiry, to bring stakeholders together, first of all, to have a discussion about the ambition, what we're trying to achieve on Dartmoor, and to try to set a common vision. And once we've got that common vision, to try to implement it on the ground through land use framework and mapping. And we're doing that in two main ways. One is to develop a geospatial map, GIS mapping tool that can identify what we've got at the moment, the physical and the biological capability of all those different land areas. And I would say that while Dartmoor is a large area of upland moorland, there's a lot of variation in that land as well, and a lot of diversity in that land. And I suppose one of the risks for me of being too theoretical about land use framework and land use mapping is that we homogenize and put land into certain categories, and we don't allow for the fact that there will always be variation, and we want that variation and diversity even within fairly small areas of land as well. So whilst on Dartmoor there's large areas of land that are clearly important for peatland and carbon restoration and water storage, there are still huge areas of land on Dartmoor that can be used for food production as well. And I guess our challenge is to try to make sure that we get a proportionate balance of multifunctionality from that area of land. So as I say, we're working on developing a GIS spatial mapping tool to identify what is there currently, and we're using data that is coming from various sources to try to populate that initial mapping area. Those data sources will be coming from Natural England in terms of designated sites, from Southwest Water, from the Devon Local Nature Recovery Strategy as well, who's done quite a lot of work on mapping, from the Southwest Peatland Partnership. So we're trying to find all of the existing evidence and data that we can start the foundation population of a GIS mapping tool that can, with all of those different land uses overlaying on top of each other. So we can look at them all, or we can look at them, each of them in isolation, if you like. And then once we've established that GIS mapping tool, that framework, that foundation, the next stage is to look at the opportunities, because this is an area where there are high expectations in terms of a greater level of the delivery of public goods, nature and natural resources, underpinned by farming and livestock farming. So the next stage, once we've got that foundation in place, is to look at the potential opportunities, the theoretical opportunities, where we could re-wet more peatland, and we could improve some of the designated site condition. We could control some of the millennia. We could plant trees. We could do some more tree planting along some of those water edges as well. And then from that point, think about trying to ground truth that back out on the ground. So to take that opportunity mapping back out to local communities, groups of commoners, to see if what we've produced in theory actually does work in practice on the ground. So there would be a process of ground truthing of the theoretical possibilities of that land. And then the third pillar, so that's the first pillar is about overlaying what data and what evidence we've got at the moment. The second layer is about looking at the opportunities, and the third layer is looking at the enabling factors that would allow us to make the most of those opportunities. And so we would start to go into a process of talking with those commoners and the landowners and the graziers about the mechanisms that would allow those opportunities to be achieved, really. And that will relate then back to agri-environment schemes, future agri-environment schemes for Dartmoor. It would relate to green finance, public finance schemes that might be available in the area as well. So it's all about identifying those enabling factors that mean that the ambition for Dartmoor, those opportunities that we've identified, can actually work in practice. The fundamental aim on Dartmoor, I would say, is to improve the outcomes for nature and to improve the outcomes for natural resources, but for those outcomes to be underpinned by viable farming businesses. And I think there is a recognition that farming and grazing livestock is going to be a key part of Dartmoor's future. And this is all about trying to bring people together to get that balance right, and then identifying where the opportunities are to make improvements for nature and natural resources and for farm viability, and then identify the enabling factors to bring them to life. We're at the early stages of this work, I would say, that we're working closely with Exeter University on that spatial mapping tool. And we're fairly advanced in terms of what we call a data observatory, which will be the foundation information that provides the baseline for the mapping tool. So at the very early stages, and I think over this next 2 or 3 months, we'll be testing a tool that starts to bring this into action on the ground. We are also trialling a number of different land management types on Dartmoor, and we'll be testing the mapping process and the opportunities mapping through the trials that we run over this next 9 to 12 months. I think I'll leave it there for a moment, Georgie, but I think this is a really good example of where we can bring some of the ambition that's set out in the national land use framework into to life in a specific area of England to see how we can make it work on the ground. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Phil. Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty of questions in the chat already. So let's leave it there and we'll come to questions later. Carolyn, I'm going to pass over to you now, and I'm sure we'll have many more questions.
Hi, afternoon, everyone, and thank you. And that was a really interesting speaker before me. Just to give a bit of further information on me, I've had a recently changed role. So my role is Director for Environment and Planning, but one of the key things that I'm now required to do is look at commissioning. So to look at place, and by place I mean everything that's outside your front door, and look at how we deliver and how we can deliver better, more efficiently, more quicker, more better quality, and how we do that in short spaces of times with tight targets. And just to reiterate from an earlier comment, there are a lot of competing priorities, competing issues at the local level, especially around land use. And then if you overlay across that strategic issues such as climate change, the demands of public health and adult social care, deprivation, then you've got a veritable cocktail of issues that you've got to deal with within place. And couple that with a lack of money, no money, or single issue pots, or lots of fragmented funding pots. You've got very strong emerging issues around how you can deliver and how you can deliver for everyone, and how you can deliver to residents that don't normally get the best start in life as well. When I first came to Surrey, I joined Surrey in 2020. I was experiencing all the issues that we've talked about earlier on in terms of lots of competing land use issues. Surrey has 10,000 acres of countryside land, much of it SSI, and quite a bit of it that needs to be in improving condition. We have almost 5,000 acres of land that's very much almost indeterminate. So it's bits of land here and there that are classed as land infrastructure, but we don't quite know how we're using them, or we want to use them better. We've got lots of flooding issues across the estate, income issues. A lot of our farms have very poor rate of returns. So there's lots of issues there that we have to manage moving forwards. And there's lots of pressure to look at how do we keep land? Do we sell it? Do we change the use of that land? Do we invest and improve that land? And all of that requires decisions around investment, of which we didn't at the time have any comprehensive tool to make those decisions that took in all the different decisions or all the different aspects, and not just either finance or environment or something else. So we developed a land use framework then. Primarily it was for the SCC estate, but to actually then build on and grow into a land use framework for Surrey as a whole. And I was glad when I saw the land use framework come out that it's actually quite consistent with what we've already developed, which is good. So it's an evidence base, it's a vision, it's a set of principles, and it's a set of policies around all the different issues. And we've used this along with mapping to start to really make a decision about what we want to do on our land and what we want to do within Surrey. You could say, how does this help in terms of delivery? We've got lots of maps, lots of evidence, and lots of information, but actually one of the biggest key things it's helped us do is to bring partners round a table to look at what their issues are, what our issues are, and that's partners from within my organisation to external, and see how those issues link at a land use level, and how we can link up those different funding streams and achieve bigger and better outcomes. And it also helps us tell a story as to how things fit together. So how we use the framework is very much around, we use it to identify those priorities, we use it to assess opportunities, to identify conflict between different priorities. We use it to look at where we need to do things that need prescribed conditions, so sensitive habitats, so that needs to be done over there, so we protect it. We use it to understand how things can coexist together, and also how we can layer different bits of data and different bits of evidence on top, so we can get that all-important multifunctionality. So if we're planting a wood, how does that, or wood or trees, how does that link to air quality and other issues such as that? So we use that overlaying data, and we're starting to use it to identify where we need to identify trade-offs. And when we do trade-offs, having high quality trade-offs rather than trade-offs that are thought of down the line that aren't high quality and don't benefit anyone. It also allows us to start to blend finance and make the most of finance that we wouldn't normally link up, and crucially to tell a story to all our partners, stakeholders, and to our members. So I said the key use for us was having that conversation with partners and delivery partners to see how things fit together. So on an organisational level, we discussed with our land and property division about what land they had, what land we needed, how we could potentially use some of our underperforming farms to either do things like natural flood risk management or B&G, which we could then sell on, to be able to sell on or use to enable our own developments, but also how we could use bits of land to help us do our biodiversity duty. So creating once just blank bits of plain grass into meadowland that had then helped us to achieve our biodiversity duty as well. But probably more exciting is when you take it into the wider Surrey area, or into how we deliver our services in the wider Surrey area. And we've used it to cross risks and opportunities. So looking at our adaptation strategy and looking at where our key risks are from climate change, whether that's drought, flooding or wildfires, or loss of biodiversity, and where we can integrate strategies and strategy needs and where they're quite complementary. And that's been really useful for us because it's helped us to team up natural flood management with looking at controlling fires, with looking at biodiversity and creating more space for residents. There's 3 particular projects that have worked really well. One is a project around our super NNR, which is Wealden NNR, and it's called Heathland Connections, which looks at how we work with a number of different partners and combine that economic development, the visitor economy, nature recovery, and also adaptation. It's allowed us to see with multiple partners how we work together and how we tackle that collectively. The second project is our Ash Ranges project, where we've looked at an area in that same Heathland Connections area that we've had dual issues of flooding, drought, heat, and wildfires, and we've worked collectively with the Ministry of Defence to work on Ministry of Defence land to start putting in natural flood risk management so that the water is held back. So we recreate some habitats, but we also use it as natural flood breaks, which protects the surrounding community, but also water storage, which acts as fire breaks as well. And these are emerging new projects, and using the land use framework and the data and the mapping has allowed us to have those conversations with the Ministry of Defence to show how natural flood risk management works. And it's been a really good communicating tool. The last example is very much around a piece of land where, again, the catalyst was flooding. And we had lots of flooding in that area. There'd been issues with the water company. There'd been issues with various bits of antisocial behaviour, poor land getting access to schools, that sort of thing. And we managed to combine all those issues and create an area for water storage, which has protected lots of houses downstream, but also to recreate an area of recreation and high biodiversity with a good access area. So it's worked really, really well. Into the future, the land use framework is going to be critical, and building on what we've already got in Surrey, but also the National Land Use Framework, in how we look at spatial development strategies and how we look at land use decisions within that framework. It's an emerging picture. Spatial development strategies will look at the infrastructure that is needed within an area for growth and for health and for transport and for other things, for the infrastructure for place. What I would like to see, and working with current colleagues, is using the land use framework is how we can ensure that environment and natural capital is seen more of an infrastructure, and how that we can then embed that into a traditional spatial development strategy as an infrastructure and not just as a piece of land that is impacted by infrastructure. And the land use framework for me will be really useful for that. How it fits in with the decision-making framework will need to be worked through. But I think it's a really big opportunity to have the land use framework to be able to bring that down to a local level and then integrate it with what is a growth strategy and get that good growth that we need that doesn't compromise. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. And yeah, the governments are very clear that whilst growth is a priority, so is making sure we have secure food production and nature restoration and climate adaptation. I'm going to introduce Sue Pritchard then to finalise the panel.
Thank you, Georgie, and thank you everybody, and thank you for all of the questions in the Q&A too, which is a delightfully representative cross-section of really particular and specific questions and big philosophical and general questions, which in a way is a kind of microcosm of what the land use framework is actually trying to deal with. We are focusing in this particular webinar on, if you like, the next steps for the land use framework, for the implementation and delivery process. But before I just go on to say a little bit more about that, I do want to just acknowledge, well, honour actually all of the people who've been doing work on this for decades. Actually, people have been taught, and some of you are on the call. I've seen your names pop up as we go through. People who've been working on improving land use decisions, who've been working in their own professional contexts, either in specialist land professions or in planning or in farming. And that actually is really important. The questions that are being raised are not new questions, and they're not actually questions that are particular to this land use framework. They are the questions. They are the questions which need to be resolved, which need to be worked on. And this land use framework offered by government is the latest attempt. It's a part of a process, not an event, as the saying goes, to resolve what are big, complex, contested issues, and they've been tackled just in the last 5-6 years alone. While we've been working on this, it's been tackled by a House of Lords inquiry, by the Royal Society, by St George's House consultation, in our own work in trials, working with people who are really skilled at delivering government policy, like Sir Michael Barber, for example, whose public value framework in Treasury kind of shaped our approach to this, our recommendations. But also the Geospatial Commission in Cabinet Office has done masses of work on data, and we work really closely with the then director, Talia Baldwin, to tackle the relationship between policy and delivery. Because as much as we all love the maps, and hey, who does not love a map? Maps don't make policy. Maps don't make change. It is really, really important to have better quality data, to make the different categories of data more widely available to more people, to make that data more practically interoperable. All of that's extremely valuable. But as Talia and I would say back in 2019, when we were still working this up, that's not going to make the decisions on the ground. That's not going to help people optimize decisions in places or even lean into the trade-offs that might be necessary. And the reason that we wanted to invite Carolyn and Phil onto the panel today, particularly because they are two brilliant examples of people who are already doing this implementation work. As Caroline said to you, she worked out that a land use framework was going to be necessary to help her do her job. What, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, Carolyn, when you started, and worked with us, as well as in her own territory in Surrey, to bring her really granular learning and insight into our research and inquiry, which we were able to share with DEFRA, Cabinet Office and other agencies and other parts of the country, so that we were together engaged in cycles of action and reflection and learning and adaptation. And we hope that is what has contributed to Max and his team's work on the land use framework that the government has felt able to bring forward. And I just want to say too, this has been a sticky topic in the civil service for a long time. It is the physical embodiment of things that the civil service find most difficult. Working across departments, working on complex topics, working in things that might be contested, that aren't going to necessarily go well for MPs in their constituencies. But it's absolutely essential work. And the fact that the civil service team has stuck with this over 5 years, to my certain knowledge, and frankly longer, is a real testament to actually how change really happens. That quality, it's a little bit unsexy, it's not in the kind of creative, innovative space, but it's the quality of perseverance, of resilience, of sticking with a thing, even though it's hard, that kind of gets stuff done. And that is also the story, I think, of how the land use framework is going to end up working in practice. So the data is really important, and the principles are really, really important. I love the principles, but my favorite diagram is that little kind of arrows up and down one that says this is only ever going to work in a kind of, you know, a kind of dialogue between national strategy and regional responsibilities, local responsibilities, and the communities and the land managers, you know, farmers who own their land, land managers, landowners, who are critical to delivering this broad range of policy intentions. So none of this is going to work without a really good relationship and dialogue between all of those levels and all of those spaces. So I think, and perhaps the unspoken feature of this land use framework, what Phil and Caroline particularly are embodying on this call, and what I think we will want to help government work on next, is what is the leadership and the skills and the capacity now that's needed in places to make this work? And some of those are people skills. Those are people and relational skills, often conflict mediation skills, often the skills of talking about stuff that is going to be really, really challenging for some sectors and some places and some communities. But as we've said, it only, you know, the materiality of all of this really comes to life when people grapple with these issues in places. The trials that we were doing in Cambridgeshire, for example, started out with a really, really vivid illustration about why this is material, why this is why this really matters. We had 80 people in a room in Cambridgeshire when we started our process there, and the kickoff was, you know, people around tables, as they often are in these kinds of events, and with big maps on tables, and inviting people who'd come from all sorts of backgrounds: farmers, land managers, nature specialists, environmentalists, public health, councils, planners, real cross-section of people in the room. And we said, just mark on these lovely big maps of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough what you think the issues are. And after half an hour, I wandered around to see what people were doing. And on at least half of the tables, the maps were entirely coloured in blue. And people said, if we don't sort out our ability to respond to and mitigate the climate crisis, our county is going to be underwater. It's going to be prone to flooding. It's going to be under salt water. One saltwater ingress is going to be enough to change the way we can farm here. And so the materiality of these questions become really vivid in place. So lots of the questions in the chat and in the Q&A are often what if questions. And what would you do if, what if? I'm sorry, my dogs are joining in now. But the what if questions really are best answered when folk like Phil and Caroline bring people together in their communities to say, so here are the big policy intentions. What are we actually going to do about this? And Teresa, I can see your question popping up there. It's popped up in the chat. We've heard quite a bit of feedback from farmers who've not been involved in the trials and pilots about how this can work for them. But what I can tell you is that where we've been trialing these approaches and where Caroline and Phil are doing this work, farmers and land managers are involved. They're involved from different sectors: horticulture, arable, livestock, mixed farming in different places around the country. And what they say to us in those trials, in those processes, that they would much rather be involved in some quite complicated and messy conversations, because, of course, as we all know, they have not been in the past. We've had big institutional approaches, we've had planning approaches, we've had environmental approaches, we've had infrastructure approaches down their silos. But farmers and farming has never been involved in bringing their insight, their intelligence, their experience, their perspective into that strategic planning process. And I can reassure you Teresa, particularly, there may be other questions relating to this, of course, but I just saw yours, Teresa, pop up in the chat. I can reassure you that those farmers who have participated and have engaged in trialling a process have really appreciated it. And I think everybody else has appreciated that ground truthing that farmers bring. And of course, a really critical perspective that we need right now, which is, how is the UK going to feed itself in the face of any number of future scenarios, some of which are starting to look terrifyingly close right now? So I'm going to pause now and give people some time to answer the questions that are popping up all over the place. But just finishing with this thought before we get into questions. The land use framework is not, could never be the answer, the silver bullet that, right, now we've got the answer, that sorts out all of these issues. That was never going to happen. I don't think anybody ever believed that. But it describes a set of principles and a set of practices and a set of approaches that surfaces the questions that we really get into and gives, I think, a bit of confidence to those people, again, like Caroline, like Phil, and there are lots of others who are trying to make this happen right now, that they have both the attention of government and the support of government, and now a clearer relationship with government about how all this is going to work. And I think that's a big, big, big step forward. So back to you, Georgie, and we'll see how we can respond. There's loads of questions popping up.
There are loads of questions. Thank you very much, Sue. I'm going to try and group some of them because there are some overlaps. I hope that everyone can now see the questions. Apologies that that wasn't visible earlier, but they should be visible and upvotable now. I'm going to group some of them because there are some with overlapping meanings. I think the first one would be, how will different areas of government work together? So how will DEFRA work with NISTA, DESNES, MHCLG? Max, that's probably one for you. And then also at different scales. And Caroline, I'd be keen to hear your view on that as well afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of ways the government does already work together. I think it's just a question of how well they're exercised and put into practice. I think from our point of view, a lot of the challenges around working together on land use have been the lack of common data mapping, understanding of the spatial implications of what different departments have been putting forward. And that's something that's massively changed in the last couple of years since we first started talking about land use framework. So I'm relatively optimistic that's happening. And there's also the commitments that are put in the consistent spatial vision section of the framework at the start of section 3, talking about how we're going to have more coordination brokered by I mentioned the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, which is the new post-National Infrastructure Commission body, NISTA, that government set up, essentially to try and coordinate across government and have a bit of weight in doing that, so that we're all drawing our infrastructure aspirations and departmental aspirations on the same number of hectares, essentially.
Carolyn, do you have anything to add on how you'd like to work with central government?
I think it's having that discussion around the national policies and how and being able to have that flexibility of how that actually relates to a local area, because not all national policies relate to a specific area, and then being able to take those policies and national evidence bases and match it with local evidence base and set a distinct set of principles that then allows us to apply those principles into specific projects and initiatives. So you can really get it into very localized, very relevant projects and initiatives and management plans rather than broad brush. So I think that working with national government, especially through the devolution agenda, is having a really good conversation about what is best to say at national level. So principles are great, but then how do we translate that down into local, and where can we have flexibility where we've got differing conditions at the local level? So that continued conversation rather than a accepted once and done, one size fits all, because it doesn't. And being able to couple the national with local evidence base and be able to see that spatially mapped helps us to tweak things or change things or just not do them if they're not relevant. So, and also it helps us very much when you talk about land use at a national level, and then you've got very specific local level issues. It allows us to bring in stakeholders and farming tenants, as there was chat in the question, and other partners to say, okay, this is what's being said at this level. This is what we're seeing on the ground. How would it work? And what's your view? Because data tells us one thing, but actually putting that into local context gives you much more view of what that actually means.
Thank you very much, both. I'm going to go swiftly on to a kind of joint question around the kind of potential synergies and also trade-offs on land use. So what are the mechanisms or incentives for identifying and optimizing those? And equally, what are the mechanisms / incentives to deliver better multifunctionality? And I think that's really open to everybody on this panel. I don't know if anybody would like to go first on that.
Yeah, Georgie, could I come in a little bit on the last question before we come on to that one?
Yeah, very quickly.
Yeah, no, very, very quickly. But it's just to say that, I mean, I think that I see a much better level of connectivity across DEFRA than I used to. I think there's some real strides that have been made to try and connect lots of those DEFRA areas of interest together. It's a real struggle, and I think we still see some challenges with some really specific teams, I guess, who aren't necessarily yet brought into the whole, such as, I suppose, the genetics and livestock and equines team. That sometimes, I'm not saying it's their fault, but sometimes you just find a cluster within DEFRA that seems to be working in isolation and haven't managed to become part of the whole. And I would also say that, we need to make much stronger links, not just within DEFRA, but across other departments, government departments as well, particularly trade. I think when we're talking about this sort of land use change and farming and food, the connection with our trade policy is crucial, and I don't think we're as well connected there. And just finally to say that it's not just government, it's the government's arm's length bodies as well. It's bodies like Natural England, the Environment Agency. I'd even include AHDB in this as well. Those the organisations that work alongside and with government policy to make them part of this whole journey, I suppose, is really, really essential.
Yeah,
thanks, Phil.
absolutely.
And to the previous / second question, I'm going to go Max and then Sue.
Yeah, could you? So it was around incentives for multifunctionality and
yeah. Well, I think particularly in sort of understanding potential synergies and trade-offs around land use in particular places, and then conversely, what are the incentives to delivering multifunctionality? Well, yeah. What does that look like?
So on the former, I mean, there's a tendency of working on things like the land use framework to always resort to data, but I think there is a data challenge on this one and a tools challenge, because I think something we hear from land managers, whether they're planners, farmers, or local communities, is when you're actually trying to look at what a particular piece of land might be best suited to, if you're putting together a local plan or something, there's always a million different really helpful maps across the internet and across gov.uk, but none of them actually interact. So it tells you the land is great for forestry, and it's great for flood prevention, and it's great for growing whatever, and there's nothing that actually brings it together to actually relatively looking at the national perspective. This is actually relatively better for this particular outcome or use. So I think we're looking at moving more into combined mapping and approaches that do some of that comparison for the user in the long term. And so that's in some of our data section. And on the incentives, I think there's potentially a really long answer there, because it really depends on the uses involved. There's incentives reaching into planning, so making sure that development also delivers for nature. There's levers through the environmental land management schemes to make sure that we are getting generally multifunctional land use most of the time, that manages impact as well as getting the best food production. So yeah, I don't know if any others have particular comments they'd like to throw in on that one. Otherwise, I'll ramble.
Would you mind if I come in briefly on that?
Yeah, go for it.
So the new spatial development strategies that I referred to earlier will be digital based. So there'll be an ability to overlay lots of different maps from different sectors. So from the water sector, the energy sector, from transport sector, from lots of different areas and departments, and be able to see how they do interact and we should hopefully be able to do scenarios. So climate change was mentioned in the chat, so we should hopefully be able to do scenario planning around different levels of heating or cooling, and to see how things interact. So I think that will be really helpful in terms of incentives and encouraging people. I think the more that we can make it easier to stack benefits and to make it easier for different things like carbon and biodiversity to come together is really important. That will help, because it simplifies the incentive market. At the minute, it's really complex. And the other bit is, the more we can stop having separate, not necessarily stop having separate, but make sure the different issues are integrated within different funding streams. So if you've got a funding stream for a transport project, how do you integrate other issues within that funding stream, so it allows people to start delivering multifunctionality?
Sue, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm just going to add a quick one, because the other thing that the framework enables local leaders to do is start mapping all of the resources that they already have in the system. So you can map data, you can map territory, but you can also start mapping all of the resources that have an impact on land and land use decisions. And in big organizational change or strategy work I've done in the past, that can be one of the most revealing processes that help to align activity much more effectively. Very often we find, when we talk about incentives, we're thinking about, well, where's the new money going to come from? We're going to need to work out where the new money is to get people to do things. But we forget that there's already a lot of money in the system. There's already a lot of money doing different things in different ways and for different purposes, and sometimes contradictory purposes. And when we can map the resources alongside the requirements and the policies and the spatial data, we start getting a really, really rich picture how we get better public value and how we serve the public interest much more effectively than we currently do. So lots of the stuff that we're talking about here isn't so much answering questions, although it does do a lot of that. It starts to set up the next questions that we need to ask and respond to, and that can be as fruitful for policy development and for policy delivery as anything.
Thanks, Sue. I'm sorry, I'm very aware we're already past the hour, so I'm going to choose 2 more questions, and I think we can call it a day since we're already over time. I think one important one that's come up a couple of times is questions around the uplands. So Jennifer Dosworth would like to hear more about how the panel understands how the land use framework will be implemented in the uplands. What does that mean in terms of multi-functionality for the above average land use change? And what does that mean, I think, Phil, in particular, for like commoning, for access to the commons, and what that means for commoners? So I think maybe start with Phil, and then if others want to come in, go from there.
Yeah, I think land use framework has done a good job in terms of teasing out some of the key attributes of different land types, but it's also a really key thing through the framework has also been around that recognition of multifunctionality, and it's surely got to be about multifunctionality in the right place, at the right level, and the right balance. And if you look at an area like Dartmoor and a lot of our other upland areas, it is clear that these are truly multifunctional areas where we've got a very wide range of expectations. I think in the future we're going to see our farmers and our commoners and graziers sourcing their income sources from a much wider range of places. Some will come from the marketplace, some will come from land management through livestock. There'll also be a host of public goods and other income sources that they'll be tapping into. I've got no doubt about that. One question I've got, I guess, is still, if we are looking, particularly in our uplands, if we're looking for really particular specific approaches to our farming in these areas, which are largely based on very sensitive methods of farming, often using very traditional techniques, to what extent can they really dovetail with a more industrial and international supply chain and infrastructure. And I'm not sure that we can look at land management and grazing and farming in isolation without looking at things way, way beyond the farm gate. So that's where I really welcome some of the work that's being talked about with the Uplands Experiment, Hilary Cotton, where we can actually look at communities, economies, infrastructure, food systems, because I think we need to be looking at all of that within the change that we're looking at and trying to get that balance right.
Max or anyone else, did you want to come in on the Uplands?
Yeah, just to note, echo what Phil said. I think the multifunctionality principle is in there, I think, as well as the right change in the right place. And if there's a reference there to the map showing a greater than average change in the uplands, I mean, it is true that's what the model suggests in terms of balancing those different outcomes. But there's a whole range of different changes within that change. It's not all, you know, tree planting or anything like that. It's a myriad of different things, and even in the areas of highest change on those maps, you know, it's still the minority of land that's changing, which is still significant, but it's important to put that in context. That doesn't mean all of the land is changing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to ask a question now about diet and food, because I mean the land use framework doesn't make any reference to diet change, although it does talk quite a lot about food security. So I think, Sue, would you like to comment on that first, and then Max, I might also come to you.
It's a really, really important question. And of course, this isn't the only thing that government is doing right now. In DEFRA, there are 3 key strategies that work really closely together. Land use frameworks come out first. The food strategy is underway right now, and at FFCC we're supporting the government with the Citizens Advisory Council, bringing citizens' perspectives to the heart of policy making, and we presented some of the citizens' work to ministers just last week, and they're asking these questions too, and they have lots of really positive thoughts about what works in places and how some of these bigger questions can be resolved in places. So there was some great feedback coming from Cornwall, from Yorkshire, from the Northeast, from Liverpool, direct from citizens and from businesses, organisations and farmers in those places, talking about how this is going to work in reality. But it does, and then of course the farming roadmap is going to be published too, which will set out the roadmap for farming and farmers to start to plan for, which, and I think it says it in this framework, there's a sentence in the framework in the 2050 vision that says people will have more food on their plate that is grown to, you know, high ecological and welfare standards, but it's food they recognise. So instead of people, and the subtext for me is, instead of farmers growing more and more commodities that go into, you know, a global food system that produces essentially unhealthy ultra-processed foods or feed for animals and livestock, farmers will be able to grow more of the healthy food that we need on our plates. And so that's, I think, a very positive connection between the framework and the farming roadmap and the sorts of things that we have to think about in terms of what we eat, what we grow and how we grow it. So this isn't the only thing. This is connected to other government strategies, and some of this is going to be going on in the Department of Health too. You know, the relationship between what we grow and what we eat is shared across government departments, and it's also being picked up there. So it's kind of it is a critical component, but it is just one component amongst all of these other strategies that have to work together. And I think the way that civil service has approached this with their colleagues in other departments is actually giving me some confidence that that connection is really starting to bear fruit.
I think, Carolyn, do you want to come in on that as well?
Just briefly, I think the land use framework, and when it's coupled with other strategies such as public health and local economic strategies, can be used as a starting point for conversations around things like community growing, land allocated for local allotments, community orchards and things like that. So it's not a huge impact, but it does start the conversation around that, more about that that type of activity.
Fantastic, thank you. So a question here from Tom: where does the committing to the well-being of future generations fit in an English land use framework, which doesn't have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act like Wales has. Quite a big economic question there. I think, I mean, does anybody particularly want to answer that first?
I mean, I can acknowledge it. I think that's a fair observation. I think broadly the land use framework is trying to move us to a picture of long-termism and thinking about 2050. I think there's another question that points out that 2050 is actually a relatively short time horizon in the world of agriculture, land use change and everything else. I think that's very fair. And I think there's an intention, certainly here within the team anyway, that when we start to move on to our climate adaptation thinking and some of the actions in the document, that we do take on a longer time horizon than 2050. But I think in terms of thinking about how policy adapts, 25 years is a very long time for governments to be considering, for people to be thinking about how they respond to a consultation. So I think, yes, I would take both points from those questions and I hope to give some reassurance that we're very conscious of that and trying to
I think there were two the future generations, really, really important. And the other, if you like, contributor to all of this that often gets lost are people in other nations, people in other countries. If we start making decisions for the UK that just offshores our impacts elsewhere in the world or creates, ghost acres that aren't taken into account in our own calculations, we're not really tackling the problem, because the climate crisis, the nature crisis are not even national challenges, they're huge global challenges. And so thinking about future generations, but also thinking about the impact that we have, the decisions that we make in the UK on other countries, particularly the countries that are most vulnerable to geopolitical shocks and climate change, is really, really critical. And again, it's not part of the land use framework, but it's stuff that we're working on anyway at FSCC with colleagues and with partners. The UK is going to be hosting the G20 in 2027, and we're already starting to surface the kinds of questions that we would like to see the UK leadership really leading on in the global context.
And just to add to that, Georgie, if we can manage to integrate and link strongly the land use framework with spatial development strategies, these are vision-led strategies, and their lifetime for each strategy is between 15 and 20 years, but the vision is 50 years. So it allows us to scenario plan into the future, and being able to take the land use framework through that or with that allows us to look much more to future generations.
Absolutely. There's another question in here. There are a couple of questions in here about other scales of implementation, particularly around bioregions and river catchments. And essentially, given that a lot of the planetary boundaries are affected by land uses that are perhaps managed at one of those scales, how does the framework help us manage those different challenges? Open to the floor.
I'll have a go at that on the geographies and the sort of spatial planning geographies. Yeah, it's something that comes up a lot here, and obviously as the sort of post-Cunliffe review water planning reforms are sort of being developed in DEFRA, it's something we're having a lot of conversations about, whether it's the old catchment plans or catchment unit spatial planning versus counties versus combined authorities, etc. And I think the conclusion of a lot of colleagues, at least, is that this is really important to think about, because it makes sense to plan according to the geographies that affect the outcomes you're considering. But ultimately, the decisions need to work across sectors. And so the most important thing is that whatever scales people are working to, that they're able to communicate their plans, proposals, constraints effectively across those geographies. So I'm afraid I'm going to play the data and tools card yet again on the land use framework. And so I think that's where we see most of the solutions lying, as well as making sure that the processes line up. There's other challenges in terms of joining up those processes, like timescales for refreshing those plans and that sort of thing that we need to address. But I think essentially making sure people, I don't know, Carolyn, you've probably got views on this.
Yeah, I think it's a case of, because you can be restricted by boundaries, or you can look beyond. And I think a lot of the drive at the minute is to obviously see the local side, but to be looking, and there's a big push from government to look beyond your boundaries. So I think we just need to take a very much a systems-based approach and have that ability to link up with partners around you, so that you're not confined to just one area and you're not confined to one sector. So you take that systems integrated approach, and it's difficult to do, and can be quite confusing and lead to one issue expanding out into a massive issue. But I think that's the way we need to at least start, and always keep that in mind.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is a question on how often it will be reviewed, which is actually answered in the framework. It will be reviewed every 5 years, but I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege to expand on that and ask Max what this actually looks like in practice. Like, what will the land use unit be doing? Who will you be engaging with? Will you be doing trials? What will that work look like?
Yeah, I think a lot of it's to be confirmed in terms of being able to publicly commit to lots of this stuff. But I think you can see hints of it through the framework in terms of commitments to release further data, get data in from the local and regional plans into the national sort of data set, so that we can start to take more account of what's actually needed at local levels. And also, yeah, I mean, I think essentially continued engagement in the short term, working on data, and then doing that sort of joined up map at the national level to further the stuff we've talked about getting government to speak more fluently on land use with one voice. So I think it's a bit of internal machine fixing for the short term, then moving out more to external engagement again. Awesome, thanks.
I think it was mentioned somewhere in the chat, but I can't find it in the Q&A, but somebody mentioned private finance. The framework does seem to rely on private finance to deliver some of its outcomes, and I'm just wondering what the next steps are in terms of making that a viable option. Obviously, private finance markets, in terms of green finance, still quite immature. What are the next steps in terms of making that a workable proposition?
That's the catch-22 of all questions there. And we have that conversation both for carbon, for nature, for lots of different things. Is how do we bring in private finance? And the key thing to that underlying is always build the business case. What's in it for them? And by that you have to create a market, and that's either regulation or it's incentive or it's pressure from the public. When you're looking at nature recovery, there's a lot of land that is available, so the supply is there that can be improved, but who's the buyer, who's paying? And it's that bit that we need to crack, and we haven't cracked it yet. But there are different, I think we can't, there will never be one silver bullet. So for example, I was talking to some colleagues about, in one area it might be that you get massive flooding, so you bring the insurance industry in other areas there might be something else. So that blended finance and that bringing people together is going to be really important, but it has to be evidence-based, and you have to really put yourself in their situation. Get out of your head the altruistic thing, because that'll happen, but never to the extent and the scale we need it. And you need to think what's in it for them. But it is a very live question.
Great answer. I'm just trying to scroll through all of the different questions, I'm afraid. I wonder, in the meantime, actually, again, another question for Max. Obviously, this is a land use framework for England. Scotland's fourth land use strategy was published on the same day, which is very exciting. How are you working? And then, sorry, obviously, net zero targets, nature targets are UK-wide. So how are you working together with Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland to deliver equitably and with a fair transition across the 4 countries?
Yeah, so yeah, worth having a look at Scotland's land use strategy, as you said, Georgie, published on the same day as England's last week. I think we've been talking to devolved administration colleagues throughout the process and doing joint research with them through the Lunds Hub as well at times. I think intention is to carry that on, and we make that commitment in the framework and probably strengthen it a bit. I think obviously they are devolved areas of government, so there's no intention to do a unified land use framework across the UK or anything like that. But I think there is probably a helpful discussion to be had on whether we move to using more sort of common data languages, common systems of mapping, that sort of thing, to help facilitate those separate processes which determine sort of equity of delivery across those UK commitments.
Awesome, thank you. There are a few questions around diet, but I think they are partly answered in the framework itself. A horticulture strategy is mentioned, poultry sector is also mentioned. There's a further question on, will there be an opportunity for local authorities to feedback or / report on work they have achieved in line with the framework? And I think this kind of speaks to that top-down, bottom-up approach of like national to local delivery. And I wonder, well, both Max and Karen are probably best placed to see how you see that working in practice.
I think you could probably report on a lot of the work you're doing through your biodiversity duty reporting, and also through the adaptation reporting. There's been a pilot on local authority adaptation reporting, and there's the consultation just came out yesterday that's looking to make that a bit more formalised, so you could report through both of those. From a top down, there is a gap. So I would say that the local government outcomes framework, which was released earlier this year or late last year, doesn't have enough in it at the moment, but it'd be through something like that, the local government outcomes framework, which then links up to how we're paid and our reason d'etre, really. But that would be where I would want to see government putting some kind of link into that. Max, that was a hint.
Yeah, noted. Yeah, thanks. And yeah, would agree with the answer. I think there's also, as I said, there's that commitment for us to work harder to get the data out of local and regional strategies. So you mentioned the biodiversity duty completion, Caroline, local nature recovery strategies, and the SDSs themselves when they come online. There's also a number of combined authorities that DEFRA is working a bit more closely with at the moment to see how some of this stuff plays out in practice and learn early lessons from them. And yeah, I think the future means of feeding back will be to be determined. I anticipate future frameworks will probably be consulted on as well. So maybe start to have a very long journey to compiling a long consultation response for 2031.
Looking forward to that. And there are a couple of questions about engaging communities and kind of stakeholder engagement locally, and particularly navigating potentially conflicts locally. And I wonder, basically, what might that look like in a land use framework? I think maybe Sue and Phil, you're best placed to answer those.
Mediating conflicts in communities just takes time. It just absolutely takes time. And if you've got to a place of conflict, then you have to invest more time to resolve that. The sorts of processes that Caroline's already described, and in fact Phil is engaged in, I think it's fair to say that the whole point of Phil's appointment was to resolve a very particular set of conflicts on Dartmoor, and the investment in that process is really quite substantial. Any conflict mediation process has to start with making sure that people are included, and they're included seriously and meaningfully. They're not being treated transactionally or as a kind of tick box consultation exercise. That people have a chance to have their concerns properly heard, have a chance to express those concerns and have them properly heard, and that they have a genuine belief that what they say might count for something, that might change the outcome. Now that can be that can show up in all sorts of different contexts, and we've got examples from solar farms, solar panels, through to stocking densities, through to housing developments, and energy. There are some really, really big and messy issues. What we found in our own trials in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough was really quite revealing. Even though there are some very sticky issues to be resolved there, over and again, we heard when we spent time in communities, when we spent time in the affected communities, people would say, for example, we were talking about housing, people would say, we're not opposed to housing and housing development, but what we are opposed to are the sorts of housing developments that damage our communities, that don't help create a bigger community, and that our own kids can't even afford. So they have very, very realistic and actually, frankly, quite reasonable concerns in that community that has a right to be brought forward. And then when you look at other really positive development processes like Nansledden down in Cornwall, the community is incredibly enthusiastic about the contribution that really quite substantial housing developments have made in an integrated, well-planned process that really contributes to the economic and social and environmental health of a place. So sometimes dealing with conflict, or even dealing with the difficult issues before conflict, can feel like a super long and super laborious and difficult process. But everything we know about what works is that you invest that time upstream at the start, you get better outcomes, and actually you get a clearer pathway to delivery ultimately, instead of getting locked up in judicial reviews or messy processes in the long term. So that's not a quick and easy answer, but that's the reality of how it is. Caroline, you're in the thick of this.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to be slightly boring, I would get involved with the planning system, because the spatial development strategies will require a lot of community engagement to get those broad, because it's vision led, so it'll be very much doing that community engagement stuff. But local plans that come out of that, which have more detailed developments and land use issues, have to consult. And what struggles at the moment is getting that meaningful consultation. So finding new ways of involving, which is what hopefully we'll be doing, involving communities in those planning discussions, making it sound a little bit more excited than planning, but getting involved right at the top end, because at the beginning of the top bit before development and before land use change is your SDS, then your local plan, and then land use change. So yeah, I would get more involved with the planning system.
Well, did you want me just to come in on? And Sue's right. This was one of the reasons, or the areas that I came into Dartmoor to try to do, to reconcile what was essentially a highly contested area, I would say. And Sue's absolutely right. It takes time. It's not something that you can rush. One of our challenges was to create a group, I suppose, which was a safe space for discussion, and that in itself is a challenge. So that people can say things that might be it could be a little bit contentious or whatever, just to bring people together to share their views. One thing I have seen is that the amount of learning that goes on through that process is incredible, actually, and the numbers of times people have said things from any perspective, and others have said, I just didn't know that, I didn't see it that way. So the level of understanding that you can gain, and I suppose the importance of that process in terms of trying to come up with a more shared vision for what we're trying to produce. The other thing I would say is that with that recognition and understanding of the challenges that different sectors are facing, you can certainly align some energy around what are the enabling factors to overcome those challenges. What can we do so that we go through this process and, as far as possible, no one's a loser, that we don't come through with winners and losers, because if we do that, then we've failed, really. So how can we get closer to a point where, as far as you can, everyone comes through a process thinking that they've not lost? It's a real challenge. I think you have to take real time. Building trust takes a huge amount of time, and it's certainly that old adage that it takes 3 years to build trust and 5 minutes to destroy it is absolutely true. So if people promise to do things, they have to be open about them. You can soon destroy any trust that you build up if promises don't come about, or you realize that people are just taking you along on a bit of a journey and don't really mean what they're saying. So it's a real challenge. But I think the two key things are bringing people together, a higher level of understanding, and then really think about those enabling factors to allow things to happen and succeed for as many people as possible.
Thank you very much, Phil. That's a wonderful place to stop, because I think it very adequately describes the challenge ahead and what needs to be done in terms of meeting all of these different demands and challenges that we have on land, and making it work for people in those places. Thank you so much to our panel. And thank you to everybody for your excellent questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. There were lots. We will be sending out a recording, and we hope to be in touch with you all very soon. Thank you so much.